A respected patriarch, a quiet rural town and a little girl who should have been protected. Instead, he raised her as his wife. This is not a folk tale. It's a real story buried in America's archives. Welcome to Hidden Docs, where we uncover America's darkest family secrets and the disturbing histories no one dares to speak of. In the rolling hills of Appalachia, where narrow dirt roads wound between coal towns and church steeples pierced the fog, reputation was everything. A man's word, his handshake, and the way he bowed his head in prayer defined whether he belonged or whether he was cast out into whispers. Among these tightly bound communities in the early 1900s, one man stood out. He was no outlaw, no drifter, no desperate bootlegger. He was respected. To neighbors, he was the embodiment of stability. He was a farmer, his calloused hands proof of a life spent tilling rocky soil and raising livestock. He attended Sunday service without fail, occupying the same pew week after week, his voice deep in hymns that echoed through wooden rafters. In a time when suspicion could follow a family for generations, he seemed above reproach. Elders nodded when he passed. Children were warned to mind their manners in his presence. He was trusted not just as a man of labor, but as a moral anchor in a world that often felt uncertain. But in the Appalachian hills, appearances were as thick as the mist and just as deceiving. Behind closed doors, where no congregation could peer and no neighbor could judge, he was crafting a life not of virtue but of control. His household was strict, his rules unbending, yet none suspected the true depth of his obsession, until tragedy delivered him an opportunity. When death claimed his brother and sister-in-law, their young daughter was left without parents. It was a common enough occurrence in an era where disease, accidents, and poverty often tore families apart. The community praised him when he stepped forward to take her in. "Blood raises blood," an elderly church deacon was reported saying in defense of the arrangement. Better kin than strangers, and so the child was brought into his home. To outsiders, it looked like a story of sacrifice, a man extending his household to protect what remained of his family. His church offered prayers for his generosity. Neighbors brought bread and blankets, comforted that the girl was not left destitute. In those first weeks, the house seemed warmer for it, filled with the sound of a child's footsteps, but some quietly noticed how quickly the girl's role shifted. She was not referred to as a daughter, nor treated as one. Instead, her existence was woven into the fabric of his household as something closer, something more possessive. He oversaw every detail of her life, what she wore, how she spoke, who she looked at. He placed her beside him in public, not at the children's table. His gaze, long and heavy, betrayed a future few dared to name. In the mountains, people rarely interfered with the private affairs of a household. Honor and shame were guarded like heirlooms, and accusations could divide entire communities. So though neighbors whispered, none acted. The church saw no scandal, at least not yet. But the seeds of suspicion had already been sown. The man who appeared righteous to his peers had, in truth, set the stage for one of the most disturbing arrangements Appalachia would ever conceal. And as the girl grew older, those whispers would sharpen into something darker, something that could no longer be dismissed as rumor. When the young girl crossed the threshold of his house, the community sighed with relief. Orphans were common in Appalachia, and the fate of a child without parents could be cruel, sent to distant relatives, fostered by strangers, or abandoned altogether. By taking her in, the man appeared to embody the very values the mountains prized: loyalty to blood, the preservation of family, the protection of kin. To the congregation, it was nothing short of selfless, but the walls of that home told a different story. At first, neighbors believed she would be raised like a daughter. They brought clothing and hand-me-down toys, gifts meant for a child still learning her letters. Yet within months, the gestures ceased. Visitors began to sense something was amiss. When they stopped by, the girl did not play outside or chatter like other children. Instead, she lingered quietly in the background, her eyes downcast, her words measured, as though every syllable required permission. One neighbor, decades later, told a Works Progress Administration interviewer that child weren't treated like no young'un. He kept her close, too close, like she weren't meant to be out of his sight. It was a remark dismissed at the time as gossip, but memory would prove sharper than rumor. As she grew, her presence beside him shifted from childlike dependency to something far more unsettling. At Sunday services, she no longer sat with the children, but was placed directly beside him, dressed in clothing too mature for her age. Locals whispered that she looked more like a companion than a ward. He instructed her in household duties far beyond her years, tasks reserved for wives rather than daughters. The girl, bound by obedience and isolation, did not resist. In Appalachia, the authority of the patriarch was unquestioned, and for a child who had lost both parents, submission was the safest path to survival. Yet her silence only fueled suspicion. By the late 1920s, the whispers sharpened. Some parishioners claimed they had seen him scolding her in hushed, almost intimate tones. Others noticed she rarely interacted with boys her own age, though girls in the valley often met at socials and barn dances. She was absent from those gatherings, held firmly within the walls of his household. The most disturbing shift came when people began to realize that she was not spoken of as his niece. Slowly, conversations dropped the title altogether. In place of child or ward, he began referring to her in ways that blurred boundaries, speaking of her as mine, never as hers. A local pastor is said to have quietly refused to baptize her when the time came, fearing the impropriety of what the community had begun to suspect. But no one dared confront him directly. In a society built on silence and self-preservation, accusations could tear apart more than one family. They could fracture an entire congregation. And so the neighbors watched, whispered, and did nothing. Within those walls, the girl's role was being rewritten by the man who was supposed to protect her. What began as guardianship had morphed into possession. The line between uncle and husband blurred, and soon it would vanish entirely. From the outside, he appeared as a watchful guardian. He purchased her clothing, dictated her lessons, and oversaw her daily routines. Neighbors believed he was simply strict, a man who valued discipline. But inside the home, this guardianship was something else entirely. It was control disguised as care. As she entered her teenage years, the boundaries collapsed. Every decision, what she wore, whom she spoke to, how she spent her hours, was dictated by him. Court transcripts from later investigations would describe her life in those years as absolute dependency, with no freedom of choice, no right to social interaction, and no ability to refuse. What others saw as protection, in truth, was the slow erasure of her identity. Locals began noticing subtle, unsettling signs. When they passed the pair in town, she no longer looked like a niece at all. He dressed her in garments that mimicked a wife's modest attire, plain yet adult, far from the dresses worn by girls her age. He kept her from school socials, barn dances, and community gatherings where teenagers usually mingled freely. To outsiders, it was justified as keeping her safe, but whispers spread that his watchfulness was not born of fatherly instinct. It was obsession. One WPA interview from the 1930s, citing townsfolk who recalled the scandal, noted, "She moved about with him like a shadow, never out of his reach. Folks said she weren't being raised, she was being claimed." By the time she reached her mid-teens, the rumors hardened into suspicion. In court filings from the county decades later, prosecutors referred to marriage-like conduct between the man and the girl. Though no marriage license was ever issued, testimonies described her as living not as a child in his care, but as a wife in his bed. These words, chilling in their precision, confirmed what the community had only whispered about in hushed tones. For the girl, escape was impossible. With no parents, no outside relatives stepping forward, and a town unwilling to intervene, her world consisted entirely of him. He schooled her privately, ensuring she never formed bonds with teachers or peers who might question her circumstances. He monitored her letters, silenced her voice, and slowly convinced the world that she was his possession. And yet, despite mounting suspicion, no one in authority acted. Ministers hesitated to condemn him directly, fearing reprisals from a man still respected in church circles. Neighbors too held back, afraid of tearing open a scandal that would stain their entire valley. And so silence reigned, even as the truth became undeniable. But cracks were beginning to form. A doctor summoned to the household in the late 1920s recorded observations of unnatural closeness between guardian and ward. The phrasing was careful, but the meaning was clear. By then, the truth was emerging, not in whispers, but in written testimony that could not be buried. The line had been crossed, and the town could no longer pretend otherwise. What began as protection had twisted into possession, and soon the consequences would no longer remain hidden. The whispers that once filled church pews and store aisles soon gave way to something impossible to ignore: an official record. In the courthouse of Breathitt County, a clerk opened a routine marriage license application and froze. The groom's name was that of a respected farmer, a man in his 50s. The bride's name was his own niece, barely 17. The license, filed in the mid-1920s, was more than a scandal. It was a declaration that he no longer cared to hide. While many in the community had long suspected something inappropriate, this was concrete proof, stamped and signed in government ink. What had been rumor now stood as fact. When word reached the townspeople, the response was swift and sharp. Local newspapers hinted at the matter with veiled disgust. One 1926 column in the Lexington Herald described a grotesque union in the mountains, a marriage between uncle and niece that violated not only law, but nature itself. Although the article withheld names, everyone in the county knew who it was meant to expose. Pastors recoiled, refusing to bless the marriage in any church. Reverend Samuel Collins of Lost Creek reportedly told his congregation, "There are unions man may arrange, but this one is against God's design." His words spread like wildfire, cementing the scandal as a moral outrage. Yet the man at the center of it all did not shrink from the backlash. Instead, he doubled down. Neighbors recalled him addressing the girl openly as his wife. He introduced her as such in town, forcing her into a role she had no choice but to play. Oral accounts collected years later by WPA interviewers record one neighbor saying, "He spoke it with pride, as if daring anyone to correct him." Legally, Kentucky law in that period forbade marriages between close kin. The state recognized such unions as void, yet prosecutions were rare. Authorities often turned a blind eye, unwilling to intervene in the private affairs of mountain families, even when those affairs crossed into taboo. In this case, though, the brazenness of filing paperwork stirred debate. Court files suggest the license was never fully processed, likely halted by clerks unwilling to endorse it. But that didn't matter. To the man, and tragically to the girl, the piece of paper had already achieved its purpose. It provided a shield, however flimsy, for him to claim her as his own. In his mind, she was no longer his ward. She was bound to him in something he dared to call marriage. The scandal deepened the divide within the community. Some residents whispered that the county sheriff should act, while others argued it was better to let the family rot in its own shame than to bring open disgrace upon Breathitt County. And so silence returned, heavy and complicit. But for the girl, the silence meant one thing only: there was no escape. She was trapped in a union that never should have existed, her name etched in county files as the bride of her own uncle. And soon, the consequences of this forbidden union would spill beyond rumor, beyond paperwork, and into tragedies the county could never bury. When the news of the marriage license circulated, the community's reaction fractured along invisible lines. Some were horrified, openly condemning the man's actions, while others chose to bury the truth in silence. In the mountains of Appalachia, silence could sometimes feel safer than confrontation. And in this case, it allowed something unspeakable to fester. Local records reveal how deeply divided Breathitt County became. In 1926, a town meeting was held in Jackson to discuss moral corruption in the Hollers. Though the Turner name was never spoken aloud, several attendees later admitted everyone knew exactly which family was meant. Yet no resolution came from the meeting. Instead, the subject was quickly tabled, replaced by talk of roads and coal taxes. The scandal had been named without being named, acknowledged but left untouched. Oral testimonies gathered decades later by WPA field workers described the fear of speaking too plainly. One woman, identified as Rachel Noble, remembered, "It was like the town agreed to forget, because remembering was worse. You didn't say their name. You didn't look too long at their house." Her words captured the uneasy balance between outrage and denial, a balance that left the girl trapped in plain sight. Even pastors, men expected to act as moral arbiters, hesitated. Reverend Samuel Collins, who had once condemned the union from his pulpit, stopped addressing it altogether. Parishioners whispered that he had been warned by relatives of the man, who insisted the family's affairs were not the church's business. Others suggested that Collins feared losing half his congregation, many of whom shared blood ties with the accused. Whatever the reason, the pulpit fell silent, leaving the community without spiritual leadership against the taboo of incest. The law, too, failed to act. Kentucky statutes at the time made marriages between uncle and niece void, but prosecutions required public testimony. And who in Breathitt County was willing to take that risk? Local officials feared that pressing charges would not only inflame the family, but also expose the county itself to ridicule. To admit that such a marriage existed within their borders was to stain the reputation of the region. Protecting their image, they let the man continue unchallenged. Meanwhile, neighbors who dared to condemn him faced subtle retaliation. Crops went missing, fences were cut, and livestock turned up dead. Small acts of intimidation reminded the community that some family members were willing to defend their patriarch by any means. Under such pressure, most residents chose quiet avoidance over confrontation. In this suffocating silence, the man's power only grew stronger. He continued parading his niece as his wife, emboldened by the absence of consequences. The few voices that once rose in protest were drowned out by fear, leaving the girl entirely isolated. And as silence hardened into complicity, the consequences of this grotesque union could no longer be confined within four walls. Soon the horror would manifest in ways too visible for the town or the world to ignore. Whispers had long circulated through the hollers, but whispers could be dismissed. Rumors could be denied. What could not be ignored, however, were the medical records that began to appear in county ledgers and hospital reports, written in the careful, clinical handwriting of doctors who had seen the consequences firsthand. In the late 1920s, Jackson Hospital received several emergency cases from the Turner household. The attending physician, Dr. William Hayes, described a young woman, pale and malnourished, presenting with her third miscarriage in as many years. He noted her age, barely 19, and the presence of an older male figure who insisted on speaking for her. Hayes's notes, preserved in county archives, revealed his suspicion. The repeated losses were not due to illness, but to the dangerous union itself. Other doctors soon echoed his findings. In one report from 1931, a stillbirth was described with chilling detail. The infant exhibited craniofacial malformations, twisted limbs, and appeared severely underweight. The mother is closely related to the father. The words were clinical, detached, yet they carried an unspeakable weight. These were no longer rumors whispered on porches. They were written proof of what incest could yield. Over time, a pattern became undeniable. The Turners' children who survived birth often suffered from fragile constitutions. Records mention frailty of bone, respiratory weakness, and intellectual limitation. One boy, born in 1933, lived only 6 months, his death certificate citing failure to thrive. Another, a girl, lived into adolescence, but was described as simple-minded and delicate. Each child was a living reminder of the cost of silence, a cost the community had once chosen to ignore. Yet, despite the growing medical evidence, officials hesitated to act. The taboo of incest was so heavy that doctors themselves often avoided reporting the true nature of these births. In many records, the words consanguinity or incestuous union appeared only in private notes, never in the official ledgers. To put such truths into the public record was to risk scandal, lawsuits, and outrage from a family known for retaliation. Still, behind closed doors, the whispers turned to murmurs, and murmurs to alarm. Teachers noticed the children's struggles in school. Midwives refused to work in the Turner household, citing unnatural conditions. Even funeral homes began keeping quiet logs of the unusually high infant deaths connected to the family. What had once been a dark secret was now written into the very fabric of the county's institutions, silent proof of a horror that could no longer be wished away. By the mid-1930s, the Turners had become a symbol not just of scandal, but of tragedy. Doctors, pastors, and neighbors alike could no longer pretend ignorance. The evidence was written in ledgers, carved on gravestones, and carried in the frail bodies of children who bore the price of one man's forbidden choices. And yet, even as the records mounted, a darker question began to emerge. If everyone now knew, why did no one stop him? The answer would plunge the community into an even deeper shadow. It took years of whispered rumors, hushed medical records, and fractured families before the walls of silence finally cracked. Law enforcement, long hesitant to intervene in what they deemed a private matter, was forced into action. The pressure came not from the town itself, but from beyond. State officials who could no longer ignore the growing file of reports. What followed was not simply a trial, but a public unmasking of a nightmare the community had worked so hard to bury. The courtroom was packed, not with strangers, but with neighbors. Faces that had once turned away in church pews now stared fixed and restless, as the man who had called himself a husband stood accused of crimes too dark to name aloud. At the center of it all was his niece, no longer a frightened child, but a young woman whose testimony would determine whether the past was finally dragged into the light. Court transcripts preserved in the county archives reveal the harrowing details. She described how he had first positioned himself as protector, then provider, then something far more sinister. She spoke of nights locked in, of a household ruled by fear, of the blurred line between parent and partner. In her own words, she called it a life I never chose. The silence in the courtroom was heavy, broken only by the scratch of pens as journalists hurried to capture every word. Newspapers seized on the story with a vengeance. Headlines called it the darkest marriage in America and a union against God and law. Reporters described the man as both monster and madman, while others pointed fingers at the town itself, accusing neighbors of complicity through silence. For many in the gallery, the shame was collective, because this wasn't just his crime. It was theirs too for letting it fester so long. Yet justice in rural America was never straightforward. While the jury heard her testimony and examined the disturbing medical records, they also listened to neighbors who defended him, men who swore he had provided for her and kept her off the streets. Some called it misguided love. Others argued it was simply a family matter that had been blown out of proportion by outsiders. When the verdict was read, the room was split in two, half gasps of relief, half sighs of disbelief. He was found guilty of certain charges, but spared the full weight of the law. His sentence, though significant on paper, fell short of the community's whispered hopes for justice. For many, it felt less like resolution and more like compromise, a reluctant acknowledgement of guilt without the full courage to punish it. The trial ended, but the shadows it revealed did not. For the niece, it meant freedom, though scarred and fragile. For the town, it meant living with the knowledge that their silence had allowed horror to grow unchecked. And for history, it left a chilling question. Was justice truly served, or had the system simply given shape to the same silence that had always lingered in those hills? The reckoning had come, but its verdict left more questions than answers. And in those unanswered questions, the darkness never fully lifted. Conviction was supposed to close the chapter. The courtroom doors had swung shut, the headlines had burned their way through the presses, and the town had braced itself for the slow process of forgetting. But forgetting was never truly possible, not when the evidence of what he had done was carved into the fragile bodies of children and etched across rows of weathered headstones. The man himself lived out his years in the shadows of disgrace. His once respected name was stripped from church rosters, erased from civic records, and whispered only in cautionary tones. But the children, those born of a union that should never have existed, carried scars that no verdict could erase. For them, justice was a word without meaning. Doctors documented the legacy in clinical detail. Medical files tell of infants born frail, their lungs weak, their bones brittle. Some lived only weeks, their lives extinguished before they could even be counted in census rolls. Others survived but carried the marks of consanguinity, twisted spines, clouded eyes, and the weight of stigma heavier than any physical ailment. Each diagnosis was more than just a line in a medical chart. It was a living reminder of the price of silence. Grave markers in forgotten cemeteries bear mute testimony to this legacy. Tiny stones, weather-beaten and nearly illegible, record names that rarely lasted more than a year or two. Some graves bore no names at all, just dates that told of children who had scarcely entered the world before they were taken back by it. Locals who walk these burial grounds today may not know their stories, but the sheer number of small plots tells its own grim truth. The surviving children faced a different kind of death, a social one. They were marked, not by their own choices, but by the knowledge of who their father was and what their bloodline carried. In classrooms, they were whispered about. In church pews, they were pitied or avoided. The sins of one man became chains binding the lives of those who had no power to resist him. What makes this climax all the more haunting is not just the suffering, but the silence that surrounded it. Neighbors, doctors, officials, each played their part in looking away until the evidence could no longer be ignored. And by then, the damage was irreversible. His conviction may have sealed his fate, but it came too late for the generations already scarred. Today, his name rarely surfaces in history books. Records have been buried, and the community prefers the comfort of forgetting. Yet fragments remain, in dusty courthouse files, in yellowed newspaper columns, in graveyards where children rest in unmarked rows. These fragments do not allow the past to vanish. They demand acknowledgement. The horror he created did not die with him. It lingered in the fragile bloodline he left behind, in the trauma of a niece who never chose her fate, and in a town that still bears the weight of its silence. His name may be forgotten, but his deeds carved a permanent wound into the fabric of American history, and that is the true legacy of a taboo union, not simply one man's crime, but a community's complicity, and the generations who bore the cost of both. History often remembers kings, generals, and presidents, but it rarely speaks of the small towns where silence allowed horrors to thrive. This story, of a man who raised his niece not as a daughter but as a wife, remains one of America's darkest untold chapters. His conviction ended a trial, but it never erased the suffering etched into his children's bloodline or the silence that protected him for so long. In the graveyards of forgotten Appalachia, weathered stones still whisper of short lives and fragile bodies. In court archives, yellowed papers still tell of betrayal disguised as love. And in every shadowed corner where communities choose silence over justice, this legacy continues to echo. The man's name may fade, but the warning does not. It reminds us that some of the darkest tragedies are not too distant. They are woven into the hidden history of America itself. This was Hidden Darks. If you want more forgotten truths and unsettling histories pulled from the shadows, subscribe and stay with us, because the past is never truly buried.